The M4 Sherman tank has long been enshrined in popular history as the plucky but tragically overmatched underdog of the Second World War. This narrative, a potent blend of historical fact and post-war simplification, paints a picture of brave American crews in their Ronsons, a cruel nickname suggesting they ignited easily, facing off against the seemingly invincible, beast-like German Panzers. The story is told in numbers and metal. The Sherman's 75mm gun bouncing harmlessly off the thick, sloped armor of a Panther, while the German 88mm gun could punch through a Sherman's frontal plate at devastating ranges. The image is one of qualitative inferiority, of American industrial might producing a mediocre tank en masse to overwhelm a qualitatively superior enemy through sheer, bloody attrition. This is the myth of the inferior Sherman, a narrative that has persisted for decades, but one that crumbles under the weight of a more nuanced, complete understanding of armored warfare. The origins of this myth are multifaceted, rooted in the visceral and terrifying experiences of Allied tank crews. For a Sherman crewman staring down the long barrel of a Tiger or Panther, the technological disparity in firepower and armor was a terrifying, immediate reality. Their survival often depended on maneuver, artillery support, or overwhelming the enemy with numbers, a fact that did not escape the men in the hull. Their personal accounts, filled with stories of shells ricocheting off German armor, cemented the idea of the Sherman as a death trap. This hard factor analysis, comparing millimeter of armor and millimeter of gun caliber, became the dominant and easiest way to evaluate a tank's worth. By these simple metrics, the Sherman was indeed outclassed by the later German designs. Post-war, this narrative was reinforced by a generation of historians and enthusiasts who focused on the technical specifications of the machines themselves. The Panther, with its sloped armor, powerful long-barreled 75mm gun, and sophisticated suspension, was a marvel of engineering, a what-if symbol of German technical prowess. The Sherman, in comparison, appeared straightforward, simple, and unremarkable. This analysis, however, committed a critical error. It evaluated the tank as a standalone weapon, a gladiator in an arena, rather than as a single component within a vast, combined arms military system. It ignored the soft factors: reliability, logistics, crew comfort, and most importantly, communication, that ultimately determine effectiveness on a strategic scale. The myth also thrives on a fundamental misunderstanding of the American and German industrial and strategic philosophies. Germany, constrained by resources and a focus on tactical excellence, was forced to produce complex, resource-intensive wonder weapons in limited numbers. Each Panther and Tiger was a masterpiece, but a fragile, logistically demanding one. The United States, needing to equip its own army and those of its allies across two global oceans, prioritized a different kind of excellence: the excellence of mass production, reliability, and strategic mobility. The Sherman was not designed to be the best tank in a one-on-one duel. It was designed to be the most effective tank in a global war of logistics. It was reliable enough to drive hundreds of miles without breaking down, simple enough to be repaired near the front lines, and adaptable enough to serve in roles from infantry support to tank hunting. This is where the true story of the Sherman begins to diverge from a myth. The key to understanding its real value lies not in the tank itself, but in the network it operated within. While German tank commanders lamented the lack of reliable radios for their entire fleet and often had a command by hand signal or follow the leader, the United States made a revolutionary decision. Every single Sherman tank would be equipped with a powerful, multi-channel radio set. This was not a luxury. It was the core of American armor doctrine. The Americans understood that a tank is not just a mobile gun, but a node in an information network. Its value is exponentially increased by its ability to communicate, coordinate, and share situational awareness. The myth of the inferior Sherman, therefore, is a tale of looking at the wrong metrics. It focuses on the dueling capabilities of individual beasts while ignoring the power of the pack. It judges a tank by its ability to win a static duel, not by its ability to win a fluid, operational-level battle. The following chapters will dismantle this myth piece by piece, not by arguing that the Sherman was secretly a better brawler than a Panther, but by revealing that it was part of a more advanced, sophisticated, and ultimately more effective combat system. The real story of the Sherman is not found in the thickness of its armor, but in the clarity of its communications. The world's most advanced radio was not just an accessory bolted onto the Sherman. It was the weapon that made all its other weapons infinitely more effective, and it was a weapon that the German troops, relying on a fractured and primitive network, never truly knew they were facing. To fully grasp the revolutionary impact of the American radio network, one must first understand the doctrinal environment into which it was introduced, specifically the German philosophy of armored command and control. The Wehrmacht, despite being the progenitor of modern blitzkrieg, operated with a command and control system that was, at its core, aristocratic, centralized, and increasingly archaic in the face of modern, fluid warfare. Their approach can be best described as command by sight, a method that placed immense burden on individual commanders and created a critical vulnerability at the tactical level. The German system was built around the Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics. This was a brilliant concept whereby higher command would issue a broad objective, seize that bridgehead, capture that town, and subordinate commanders were given the freedom to execute the mission as they saw fit based on the immediate tactical situation. This doctrine demanded initiative, aggression, and a high degree of tactical skill from junior officers and NCOs. In the early war years, this system, combined with superior training and combat experience, proved devastatingly effective. However, Auftragstaktik had a critical, unstated prerequisite. It relied on a shared situational awareness that became increasingly difficult to maintain as the war progressed and the quality of German personnel declined. The technological manifestation of this doctrinal limitation was in the distribution and capability of their tank radios. Contrary to popular belief, the Germans were pioneers in tank radio technology. However, their approach was hierarchical and exclusive. In a German Panzer company, it was standard for only the command tanks, the platoon leader and company commander, to be equipped with a full radio set, the FUG-5. This allowed the commander to speak to his superiors and to his subordinate platoon leaders. The vast majority of tanks, the ordinary ones that formed the bulk of the unit, were often equipped only with a receiver, the FUG-2. They could listen to their commander's orders, but they could not transmit. They were mute participants in the battle. This created a rigid, one-way flow of information. The company commander was the brain, and the individual tanks were the limbs, expected to react to commands but unable to report back, warn of threats, or share local discoveries. A Panzer crew might spot a hidden anti-tank gun, an approaching enemy flanking force, or a perfect opportunity for a tactical maneuver, but they had no way to instantly communicate this to their commander or their comrades. Their only options were to fire their own weapon, attempt to attract attention by maneuvering, or dispatch a runner, a hopelessly slow method in the chaos of a mobile battle. Command was executed by what the leader could see and what he ordered his subordinates to do. The fog of war for a German Panzer unit was thick indeed, with only one or two nodes having a semi-clear view. This system placed an immense, often unbearable, strain on the platoon and company commanders. They were not just tacticians, they were the central nervous system of their entire unit. They had to be in the thick of the fight to observe the battlefield directly, leading from the front in the most literal sense. While this fostered leadership and aggression, it also made them prime targets. The loss of a company commander in a German unit could be catastrophic, effectively decapitating the unit and reducing it to a collection of isolated, uncoordinated individual tanks, each fighting its own private war. The famous German aces like Michael Wittmann were products of this system, extraordinarily skilled individual commanders in well-equipped tanks, but their successes often highlighted the system's reliance on individual heroism over collective, network capability. As the war progressed and German losses mounted, this system deteriorated further. The high-quality, veteran NCOs and junior officers who could operate effectively within Auftragstaktik became irreplaceable casualties. New crews were thrust into tanks with minimal training, and the radio discipline and tactical initiative required for the system to function evaporated. Furthermore, chronic shortages of equipment meant that even the official radio distribution was not always met. In many late war units, the number of tanks with full transmitting capabilities was even lower, forcing an even greater reliance on visual signals and prearranged plans that invariably fell apart upon first contact with the enemy. The contrast with the American system, which will be detailed in a subsequent chapter, could not be more stark. The Germans built an army of few brains and many muscles. The Americans were building an army where every soldier, every tank, was a sensory node connected to a collective consciousness. The German doctrine of command by sight was a dueling saber, elegant, deadly, and reliant on the skill of the individual wielder. The emerging American doctrine, enabled by the Sherman's advanced radio, was a net, less glamorous, but capable of entangling and overwhelming even the most skilled opponent through sheer, coordinated, ubiquitous pressure. The German troops, operating within their rigid hierarchical bubble, never knew that their enemy was fighting not as a collection of individual tanks, but as a single, cohesive, and endlessly adaptable organism. While German engineering marveled at the intricacies of mechanical components and the quality of hardened steel, the American industrial approach to warfare operated on a fundamentally different plane. The United States did not merely build weapons, it engineered integrated combat systems. This philosophy, born from the vastness of its industrial capacity and the pragmatism of its engineering culture, viewed the tank not as a singular armored vehicle, but as a single, interchangeable node within a vast, networked organism of war. The M4 Sherman was the ultimate expression of this philosophy, and its most critical component was not its gun or its armor, but the radio that connected it to the system. This systemic thinking began not on the drafting board, but on the factory floor. The American war machine was an exercise in applied logistics and production theory. The goal was not to create the perfect tank, but to create a very good tank that could be built in staggering numbers, shipped across oceans, maintained by 18-year-old mechanics in muddy fields, and adapted to a myriad of roles. The Sherman was designed for mass production from its very inception. Its components were standardized, its construction utilized extensive subassembly, and its design prioritized simplicity and reliability over technical sophistication. Factories like the Chrysler Detroit Arsenal Tank Plant were laid out not as workshops, but as assembly lines, applying the brutal efficiency of the automotive industry to the business of building armored vehicles. This was the arsenal of democracy in action, a focus on the system of production that would ensure a continuous, overwhelming flow of material to the front. This industrial philosophy directly dictated the tank's design characteristics. The Sherman's controversial initial use of a gasoline engine, for instance, was not an oversight. It was a deliberate choice based on system-wide considerations. Gasoline engines were cheaper to produce, easier to maintain, and most importantly, leveraged the entire existing logistics chain of the U.S. Army, which was built around gasoline, not diesel fuel. The tank's moderate size and weight were dictated by the need to fit on standard railway flat cars and within the hold of Liberty ships. Every aspect of the Sherman was a compromise optimized not for individual performance, but for the efficiency of the larger system of production, transportation, and supply that sustained the entire Allied war effort. The decision to equip every Sherman with a powerful, multi-channel radio was the logical culmination of this systems-based approach. To American military theorists, an uncommunicative tank was a wasted asset. It was a blind, deaf, and mute piece of metal, incapable of coordinated action or sharing the intelligence it gathered. By making the SCR-508/610 standard equipment in every tank, the U.S. Army was effectively building a mobile, armored internet. They were weaponizing information. This was a radical departure from the European model, where radios were often a luxury reserved for commanders. For America, communication was not a luxury. It was a force multiplier as critical as the main gun itself. This philosophy transformed the nature of armored command. A U.S. tank platoon was not a leader with 4 followers. It was a network of 5 interconnected nodes. The platoon leader could issue orders, but every other tank could also transmit. A driver in the lead tank spotting a minefield could instantly warn the entire platoon. A gunner in the third tank identifying an enemy anti-tank position could call out its location, allowing the entire unit to focus its fire. This distributed awareness created a form of collective intelligence on the battlefield. The unit could self-correct, adapt, and respond to threats with a speed and cohesion that was impossible for a German unit operating on a one-way command flow. The system extended beyond the individual platoon. Company and battalion commanders, equipped with even more powerful radios, could coordinate the movements of multiple platoons, call in artillery support, or request air cover from a position of relative safety, because they did not need to be at the very front to see the battle. They received a constant stream of information from their network subordinates. The Sherman, therefore, was more than just a fighting vehicle. It was a mobile command post, an artillery spotter, and a reconnaissance asset, all rolled into one. The true genius of the American industrial philosophy was that it understood that winning a modern war required winning the information battle. The German approach produced individually superior tanks that often fought in the dark, their commanders straining to see and direct the action. The American approach produced good tanks that operated with a shared, real-time picture of the battlefield. The Sherman's armor could be pierced, and its gun could be outranged, but its ability to communicate, to coordinate, and to act as part of a synchronized whole was a defensive and offensive capability that no single German panzer, no matter how thick its armor, could ever overcome. The tank was not the system. The tank within the network was the system. This was the revolutionary edge that German troops, focused on the tangible metrics of steel and firepower, completely failed to perceive until it was too late. To the untrained eye, the radio equipment inside an American Sherman tank was just another piece of utilitarian hardware, a box of wires and vacuum tubes bolted into the already cramped interior. But to the U.S. Army Signal Corps and the engineers who designed it, the SCR-508 and its successor, the SCR-610, were nothing short of technological marvels, the most advanced tactical radio systems fielded by any army in the world. They were the physical embodiment of the American doctrine of networked warfare, and their capabilities created a qualitative chasm between U.S. and German armored units that no amount of superior German armor or gunnery could easily bridge. The first and most fundamental aspect of this marvel was its ubiquity. In a radical departure from standard practice, the U.S. Army made the conscious and costly decision to install a full transceiver, a unit capable of both transmission and reception, in every single tank, from the platoon leader's vehicle down to the last tank in the column. This was not an incremental improvement. It was a philosophical revolution. It acknowledged that every crew, regardless of rank or position, was a potential source of critical battlefield intelligence and a participant in the tactical dialogue. This democratization of communication was something the German army, with its rigid hierarchy and limited radio distribution, could not replicate. Physically, the SCR-508 was a masterpiece of integrated design. It wasn't a single unit, but a system. The main receiver-transmitter unit was typically mounted in the turret bustle, accessible to both the tank commander and the loader. It was a robust piece of equipment, designed to withstand the brutal shocks, vibrations, and temperature extremes of armored warfare. But its true genius lay in its control system. Instead of forcing the commander to fiddle with the main unit itself, the system featured a remote control box located right at the commander's station. This box, with its intuitive dials and switches, allowed the commander to change frequencies, adjust volume, and switch between the system's different functions without taking his attention away from his primary duty, commanding the tank and observing the battlefield. This human-machine interface, simple yet profound, ensured that communication enhanced, rather than hindered, the commander's situational awareness. The technical specifications of the system were groundbreaking. The SCR SCR-508 operated in the 20 to 27.9 MHz frequency range and provided 10 crystal-controlled channels. This multi-channel capability was a critical feature. It allowed for structured, layered communication. A standard setup for a tank platoon would involve two primary channels. The command net. This was the platoon's primary tactical frequency. The platoon leader used it to issue orders, and all tanks in the platoon monitored it constantly. The inter-tank net. This was a separate, internal frequency that linked the tank commander directly to his own driver. This allowed the commander to give driving orders, hard left, stop, reverse, without having to physically kick or shout at the driver, a common practice in less well-equipped tanks. This internal net alone significantly improved crew coordination and reaction times in a crisis. Beyond these, the radio could access other nets. The company and battalion command nets allowed higher-level coordination, while an artillery net could be monitored or accessed to call for fire support. This multi-layered networking transformed a platoon of 5 tanks from a simple column into a multi-dimensional, information-rich entity. The practical effect of this in combat was transformative. In a German Panzer unit, a junior tank commander who spotted a hidden enemy position had limited options. In an American unit, he simply keyed his microphone and spoke. Tiger, 11 o'clock, 500 yards in the tree line. Instantly, that single piece of information, the most valuable commodity in combat, was shared with his entire platoon. The platoon leader could now make an informed decision, maneuver for a flank shot, call for a smoke screen, or order a concentrated volley. The speed of this information transfer was measured in seconds, while the German equivalent might take minutes or might not happen at all. Furthermore, the clarity and power of the SCR-508, which used FM frequency modulation as opposed to the AM amplitude modulation, more common in earlier and many German sets, resulted in clearer audio with less static and interference. In the cacophony of battle, with engines roaring and shells exploding, the ability to hear and be understood clearly was not a minor convenience. It was a matter of life and death. The SCR-508-610 was, therefore, far more than a communication device. It was a cognitive tool. It extended the senses of every crewman beyond the confines of their own steel box. It created a shared, real-time consciousness for the platoon, allowing it to act as a single, coordinated organism. It mitigated the fog of war by allowing light to shine from multiple points simultaneously. While German commanders squinted through their binoculars, trying to piece together a fragmented picture of the battle, every American tank commander was a set of eyes and ears for the entire team. This technological marvel did not just allow Americans to talk to each other. It allowed them to think and fight together in a way that their enemies could not comprehend until they were already ensnared in the net. The true power of the American radio network was not realized on a schematic or in a technical manual. It was forged in the chaos and violence of the battlefield. The theoretical advantage of the SCR-508 radio became a tangible, overwhelming tactical superiority in the hands of a well-trained U.S. tank platoon. The way these 5 tanks fought was not merely as a collection of individual vehicles, but as a single, distributed weapon system, a networked entity whose combat power was far greater than the sum of its parts. This chapter dissects the anatomy of a networked platoon in action, revealing a combat dynamic that was utterly foreign to the German Panzer units they faced. The engagement began not with the first shot, but with the first report. A U.S. tank platoon moving through the Norman bocage or the German forest was a sensory web. The lead tank, Baker 1, was the point of the spear, but it was never alone. Its commander's head was on a swivel, constantly scanning his sector. The moment he spotted something, the telltale muzzle flash of a camouflaged anti-tank gun, the distinctive shape of a Panzer IV's turret in a hedgerow, or even a suspicious pile of rubble that could conceal an ambush, his thumb would press the transmitter button. The communication was not a formal report, but a terse, standardized burst of information. Contact. Panzer. Front. 400. Orchard. In less than 3 seconds, a potential catastrophe was transformed into a managed tactical problem. The four other tanks in the platoon, which moments before had been partially blind, now shared the lead tank's eyes. They knew the enemy, the direction, the range, and the terrain. This initial data transfer triggered an instantaneous and decentralized reaction. The platoon leader, perhaps in the second or third tank, did not need to see the target himself to begin commanding. He could order a specific maneuver based on the shared picture. All Baker elements, flank right, use smoke. Or, if the situation demanded immediate fire, Baker 2 and 3 fire on that orchard. Baker 4, watch our left flank. Crucially, the other tank commanders were not passive recipients. The gunner in Baker 3, now slewing his turret toward the orchard, might spot movement further to the left. He would key his own mic. Baker 3, I have infantry left of the Panzer in the ditch. This new layer of information enriched the common operating picture, allowing the platoon leader to adjust his orders in real time, perhaps tasking Baker 4 to engage the infantry with its coaxial machine gun. This constant, multi-directional flow of information created a form of collective intelligence that was immune to the decapitation that crippled German units. If the platoon leader's tank was hit, the network did not collapse. The senior remaining tank commander would immediately take over on the command net, and the fight would continue with barely a pause. The institutional knowledge, the situational awareness, was distributed throughout the platoon, not locked in a single commander's head. This resilience was a force multiplier that German units, reliant on a few key leaders with radios, could not match. The network also fundamentally altered the dynamics of fire and maneuver. A German Panzer platoon, with its limited communication, typically had to fight as a single entity. It would advance, stop, fire, and move as a group, its actions dictated by what the commander could see and control. An American platoon could execute complex, split-second maneuvers that would have been impossible otherwise. One section of two tanks could lay down suppressing fire, pinning the enemy in place, while the other section of three tanks use a covered route to maneuver to the enemy's flank. The suppressing tanks would report the enemy's reactions, guiding the maneuvering element into the perfect firing position. The order to cease fire and shift targets was instantaneous, ensuring the enemy was hit from a new direction before they could reorient their defenses. This was not a pre-planned drill. It was an organic, adaptive process driven by continuous communication. Beyond the platoon, the network connected the tanks to the rest of the combined arms team. A platoon engaged by a powerful enemy force it could not handle alone was not doomed to a heroic last stand. The platoon leader could switch to the battalion or artillery net. Baker actual to red leg, fire mission, over. He would then transmit the map coordinates of the enemy position, called in by one of his tank commanders who had a clear view. Within minutes, a storm of high-explosive artillery shells would begin falling on the enemy, a capability granted by the radio's ability to call for support from miles away. Similarly, contact with attached infantry was seamless, allowing for detailed coordination in complex assaults on villages or strongpoints. The psychological impact on the crews was profound. They fought with a confidence born from shared awareness. They knew that help, information, and support were just a button press away. This stood in stark contrast to the isolation felt by many German tank crews, particularly those in ordinary tanks without transmitting capability, who were often left wondering about the bigger picture, feeling like a small, vulnerable cog in a machine they could not see or understand. In essence, the network platoon did not just fight more efficiently, it fought in a different dimension. German doctrine emphasized the Schwerpunkt, the point of maximum effort, where a concentrated fist would punch through enemy lines. The American network created a Schwerpunkt of information, a point of maximum awareness that allowed a numerically smaller or technically outgunned force to outthink and outmaneuver its opponent. The 5 Shermans were not 5 individual tanks. They were a single, 5-headed, 10-eyed beast, connected by a nervous system of copper wire and radio waves. This was how platoons actually fought, and it was a method of warfare for which the German army, for all its tactical brilliance, had no adequate counter. For the German military, whose intelligence gathering often relied on frontline reports, prisoner interrogations, and signal interception of higher-level command traffic, the first direct encounter with the sheer volume and nature of the American tank radio network was a profound shock. It was like tuning a radio dial, expecting to find a few clear, official stations, and instead stumbling upon a cacophony of countless local broadcasts, all speaking with startling informality and precision. This eavesdropping on the ether revealed a battlefield dynamic that contradicted everything German doctrine and experience had taught them about command, control, and the very psychology of their enemy. The initial discovery was likely gradual. German signals intelligence, Horchdienst units tasked with intercepting Allied communications, began to notice something peculiar. While they could intercept British radio traffic with relative ease, the American channels presented a different challenge. There was simply too much of it. The airwaves were saturated with traffic, not just from command levels, but from the lowest tactical echelons. They were listening to the conversations of sergeants and corporals, the commanders of individual tanks. The content of these intercepts was even more disconcerting. This was not the formal, encrypted, and sparse traffic of a rigid military hierarchy. It was a continuous, open, and shockingly fluid dialogue. A German intelligence officer listening would have been bombarded with a stream of terse, professional exchanges that painted a real-time picture of the battle from the American perspective. He would hear a young tank commander calmly state, "Baker 4, I'm taking fire from the church steeple, second-floor window." A moment later, another voice would respond, "Baker 2, Roger, engaging." Then, perhaps the platoon leader, "All Baker elements, smoke the church, we're moving east along Route Blue." This was followed by acknowledgments from all four other tanks. The Germans were hearing the American ODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, operating in real time, and its speed was breathtaking. They were witnessing the networked platoon in action, and it defied their understanding of unit cohesion. The psychological impact of this interception was multifaceted. First, it bred a sense of operational transparency that was deeply unnerving. The Germans realized that their movements were being constantly reported and tracked by every single American tank, not just by specialized reconnaissance units. An attempt to reposition a single anti-tank gun or maneuver a panzer into a flanking position could be announced to the entire American force in the sector within seconds. This negated the element of tactical surprise, a cornerstone of German military doctrine. The battlefield, which they were accustomed to controlling through the limited perspective of their commanders, was now illuminated by 100 flickering lights, each one an American tank reporting what it saw. Secondly, the nature of the communication shattered German preconceptions about the American soldier. Nazi propaganda had often portrayed the Americans as undisciplined, soft, and lacking the martial fervor of the German soldier. The traffic they intercepted told a different story. The voices were calm, professional, and focused. There was no panic, even under fire. The use of clear, standardized procedures indicated a high level of training and discipline, but it was a discipline of initiative and mutual responsibility, not of blind obedience. The German listeners heard the sound of a confident, well-equipped army that trusted its junior leaders and its technology. This was a profound psychological blow, challenging the very notion of German superiority. For the common German soldier and junior tanker, the experience was even more direct and terrifying. There are accounts of German infantrymen hearing the American radio traffic emanating from nearby Shermans, the clear English commands cutting through the battle noise. They couldn't understand the words, but the tone, calm, assured, and incessant, was unmistakable. It created an aura of invincibility around the American units. They seemed to have an almost supernatural awareness of the battlefield. For a German Panzer crewman in a tank equipped only with a receiver, the contrast was stark. He would sit in silence, listening only to the occasional order from his commander, isolated from the wider battle. Meanwhile, he could intuitively sense that the enemy was alive with communication, a hive of coordinated activity. This fostered a deep sense of isolation and technological inferiority. The German command's reaction to this shock was a mixture of disbelief and impotence. They could listen, but they could not effectively jam or disrupt this kind of distributed network. Jamming a few command frequencies was feasible. Jamming dozens of platoon-level nets across an entire divisional front was impossible. They were forced to stand by as their every move was announced, discussed, and countered by a system they could monitor but not break. This eavesdropping revealed the fundamental flaw in their own system. They had built a military that communicated like a tree, with information flowing up and down a central trunk. They were now facing a military that communicated like a neural net, where every node was connected to every other, creating a resilient, adaptive, and terrifyingly intelligent whole. The shock of listening to the ether was the shock of realizing that their enemy was not. The theoretical advantages of the American radio network and the crippling limitations of the German command-by-sight doctrine were rendered in stark, brutal reality during the infamous Battle of Villers-Bocage on June 13, 1944. This engagement, often remembered solely for the devastating ambush by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, serves as a perfect, if tragic, case study of the two opposing command philosophies in collision. The battle illustrates not only Wittmann's individual brilliance, but, more importantly, how the reactive, networked American system attempted to cope with catastrophe, while the rigid German system ultimately squandered a tactical victory. The battle began with elements of the British 22nd Armored Brigade, part of the famed 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, pushing through the Norman town of Villers-Bocage. Their objective was to exploit a perceived gap in the German lines and seize the high ground at Point 213, threatening a Panzer Lehr Division flank. The lead elements, a company of Cromwell and Sherman tanks from the 4th County of London Yeomanry, along with supporting units, paused in a column along the road east of the town. Crucially, they were operating under radio silence, a decision born from standard operating procedure to avoid detection. In this single moment, the vaunted British communication network was voluntarily switched off. They had become, effectively, a German-style unit, a collection of isolated vehicles, blind and mute to anything beyond their immediate line of sight. It was at this precise moment that Michael Wittmann, commanding a Tiger I tank of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, stumbled upon the column. What he saw was a dream target for a tank commander, a long, stationary line of enemy armor with their vulnerable sides exposed. Operating within the German doctrinal framework, Wittmann did not wait to coordinate his entire platoon. He was the brain, and he acted. His subsequent solo attack was a masterpiece of individual audacity and gunnery. He rolled down the road, systematically destroying the lead vehicles, then the tail vehicles, trapping the rest in a deadly kill zone. Within minutes, he had decimated the British vanguard. This was the German system at its most effective, a single, skilled commander exploiting a moment of enemy vulnerability with devastating force. However, the battle did not end with Wittmann's initial rampage. As he pushed into Villers-Bocage itself, the dynamic shifted dramatically. The British troops in the town itself were not under radio silence. Their network was active. The moment Wittmann's Tiger appeared at the end of the main street, the alarm was raised. Unlike the ambush column on Point 213, the units in the town could communicate. Reports of a single Tiger tank began to flood the British command net. The initiative so decisively seized by Wittmann began to slip away as the British network activated. What followed was a chaotic but coordinated response. A Sherman Firefly, the only British tank with a 17-pounder gun capable of frontally penetrating a Tiger's armor, was maneuvered into position. Infantry units were alerted and began to scurry into firing positions with PIT anti-tank weapons. The battle was no longer a one-sided ambush. It had become a desperate, close-quarters duel in the confines of town. Wittmann, now inside the British network's area of awareness, was no longer a predator hunting blind prey. He was a target. His Tiger was eventually disabled, not by another tank ace in a heroic duel, but by a coordinated effort likely involving a 6-pounder anti-tank gun and infantry, a direct result of the British forces inside the town being able to communicate and react. The aftermath of Villers-Bocage is often portrayed as a crushing British defeat, and in terms of initial losses, it was. But the battle reveals a deeper truth about networked warfare. The British, by momentarily disabling their network through radio silence, suffered a catastrophic failure that perfectly mirrored the chronic weakness of the German system. When they reactivated it, they were able to localize and ultimately neutralize the threat. Despite Whitman's immense personal advantage in armor and firepower. For the German side, Villers-Bocage was a tactical victory that highlighted a strategic weakness. Whitman's attack was a spectacular, but ultimately isolated, action. The rest of his company, lacking his initiative and perhaps clear communication, failed to follow up in a coordinated manner to crush the entire British brigade. The German response was fragmented. The brain had acted, but the body had not effectively followed. The battle was won by a hero, not by a system. In contrast, the British, after their initial disastrous failure of procedure, relied on their system to salvage a desperate situation. They proved that a networked force, even when surprised and mauled, could recover, adapt, and counterpunch because its collective awareness allowed it to reorient itself around new threat. Villers-Bocage is not just the story of Michael Whitman's skill. It is the story of what happens when an army reliant on individual genius confronts an army built on collective, networked resilience. The chaos was ultimately more manageable for the side that could talk about it. The Panzer VI Tiger Osf. It was engineered to be an apex predator on the battlefield. Its 88mm KWK 36 gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Its 100mm of frontal armor made it virtually immune to frontal attack from most standard Allied tank guns. It was a masterpiece of focused, terrifying engineering, designed to dominate the open ground and shatter enemy armored formations through sheer, overwhelming technical superiority. Yet, this very design philosophy contained the seeds of its own tactical vulnerability. The Tiger's weakness was not in its armor or its gun, but in its operational context. It was built for a duel, but it was forced to fight in a network. It was a magnificent but lonely hunter. This loneliness was a direct product of the German armor doctrine and the Tiger's own logistical and technical nature. The Tiger was a heavy panzer, conceived as a breakthrough weapon to be deployed in small, elite battalions and allocated to critical sectors of the front. It was not designed to be a ubiquitous main battle tank like the Sherman. This already limited its numerical presence. Compounding this, the Tiger was a mechanical diva. Its complex, interleaved road wheel system, while providing superb weight distribution, was a maintenance nightmare, notoriously difficult to repair in the field. Its immense weight of 57 tons made it a fuel-guzzling behemoth with limited strategic mobility, often reliant on rail transport and prone to breaking bridges. A significant number of Tigers lost in combat were not destroyed by enemy fire, but abandoned after mechanical breakdowns their crews could not fix. This combination of rarity and fragility created a specific tactical paradigm. The Tiger often fought alone or in very small packs. It could not afford to be risked in the chaotic, close-quarters brawls that characterized much of the fighting in Normandy and Italy. Its ideal engagement was a long-range ambush, where it could use its superior optics and gun to pick off enemy tanks before they could even get close enough to identify the threat, let alone effectively return fire. In this role, it was peerless, but warfare is rarely ideal. When the battle closed in, when the terrain turned to bocage or urban rubble, the Tiger's disadvantages multiplied, and its isolation became a critical liability. This is where the contrast with the network Sherman became a matter of life and death. A single Tiger might knock out the lead tank in an American platoon. In a German unit, this could cause confusion and a temporary halt. In an American platoon, it triggered an instantaneous, coordinated response. The death of the lead tank did not decapitate the unit. It provided a data point. The surviving tanks, all connected by radio, would immediately begin reporting the contact. Baker 1 is hit. Shot came from the tree line, 11 o'clock, maybe 1,000 yards. The platoon leader would not need to see the Tiger himself. He would order an immediate, pre-planned reaction. All Baker elements, smoke and displace. Baker 4 pops smoke. Baker 2 and 3 fall back to alternate position alpha. While the Tiger crew was reloading its massive, separate shell ammunition, the entire American platoon was reacting in unison. Smoke grenades launched from the designated tank would obscure the Tiger's line of sight. The other tanks would not simply reverse. They would use covered and concealed routes to fall back to a pre-reconnoiter position. The Tiger, slow to traverse its heavy turret and with poor mobility in reverse, was often left momentarily blind and stationary, its initial advantage nullified. The network platoon now began its counterhunt. The American tanks, having broken contact, did not flee. They used their radios to orchestrate a multi-vector attack. One tank would maneuver to a flanking position, reporting its progress. Baker 2, moving to flank, I have a visual on his left side. Another would provide overwatch, keeping the Tiger's last known location under observation. The platoon leader could then coordinate the moment of attack. Baker 2, fire when ready. Baker 3, suppress his position when Baker 2 engages. Suddenly, the lone Tiger, which moments before held a dominant firing position, found itself taking accurate fire from its flank while being suppressed from the front. Its commander, likely without a full radio net to call for his own support, was now fighting a battle on someone else's terms. The Sherman's 75mm gun, while incapable of piercing the Tiger's frontal armor at range, could easily disable its tracks, damage its optics, or jam its turret ring from the side or rear. A mobility kill was as good as a kill shot. The Tiger, designed to dominate a linear front, was ill-equipped to handle a networked enemy that could attack it from multiple, simultaneously communicated axes. The Tiger's hunt was lonely because its tactical ecosystem was sparse. It lacked the constant, chattering flow of information that gave the American platoons their collective consciousness. Its crew, for all their training and courage, were often operating in an information vacuum, reliant solely on what their commander could see through his periscope. They were the ultimate individualists in a war that was rapidly becoming a team sport. The Tiger was a battleship, majestic and powerful, but the Shermans were a swarm of smart, communicating torpedo boats. They could afford to lose one of their own to gather intelligence, then use that intelligence to mob and cripple the giant. The Tiger's weakness was not a flaw in its steel, but a flaw in its connectivity. It was the most fearsome predator on the battlefield, but it was doomed to hunt alone, while its prey had evolved to hunt in packs. The superiority conferred upon American armored units by their universal radio network was not merely a qualitative, soft advantage. It was a tangible, quantifiable edge that could be measured in the most critical currency of combat, time. While German doctrine spoke of Schwerpunkt, point of main effort, and Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, the U.S. Army, perhaps unknowingly, had perfected the art of accelerating the decision-making cycle itself. This chapter seeks to quantify the speed of command, the time elapsed between observing a threat and executing a coordinated response, and demonstrate how this temporal advantage translated into decisive tactical victories. The process can be broken down into a universal observe, orient, decide, act, ODA, loop, a concept later formalized by military strategist John Boyd. The side that could cycle through this loop faster could get inside their opponent's decision-making cycle, rendering their actions reactive, slow, and ultimately ineffective. The American radio network compressed every stage of this loop for a tank platoon. The German ODA loop, a sequential relay. For a German Panzer unit, the loop was a sequential and often slow relay race. Observe 5 to 30 seconds. A gunner in Panzer 104, the third tank in a column, spots an American Sherman moving into a flanking position. He alerts his commander inside the tank. Orient 10 to 60 seconds. The commander of Panzer 104 must now physically locate the threat through his own optics, verify the report, and assess the situation. Crucially, he must then orient this information within the broader tactical picture, which he can only guess at based on his limited view. Decide, 15 to 60 seconds, the commander of Panzer 104 cannot order the entire platoon. His only recourse is to decide to alert his platoon leader. He cannot transmit. He must either try to attract attention by waving flags, firing a signal flare, or maneuvering his tank erratically. If he is in a tank with only a receiver, he cannot even do this. He must wait for an order. The platoon leader in Panzer 101 must now observe the signal, orient himself to this new, fragmented piece of information, and then decide on a course of action for the entire platoon. Act. Variable. The platoon leader, if he has a radio, can now issue an order. Achtung! Feindpanzer Panzer rechts. The tanks with receivers hear it and begin to act. The tanks without receivers see the others moving and attempt to follow. The action is staggered, uncoordinated, and based on a partial picture. The total time for a coordinated German response could easily span 1 to 3 minutes, a lifetime in a tank engagement where a killing shot can be made in under 10 seconds. The American ODA loop, a parallel process. For the networked American platoon, the ODA loop was a parallel, near-simultaneous process. Observe, 2 to 5 seconds, a gunner in Baker 3 spots the same flanking movement. He immediately speaks into his intercom. Gunner to commander, Sherman, 3 o'clock, moving. Orient and decide. 5 to 10 seconds, the commander of Baker 3 confirms the sighting. His thumb hits the radio transmitter. The orient and decide phases are fused. He does not decide what the platoon should do. He decides to share the information. Baker 3, contact, Panzer 300 meters, east flank. In that single transmission, he has oriented the entire platoon. All 4 other tank commanders now know the enemy type, location, and direction. The platoon leader, hearing this, does not need to reorient from scratch. The situational picture is already built for him. His decide phase is now simplified to choosing from a set of pre-drilled maneuvers. All Baker elements execute linebacker right now. Act. 5 to 10 seconds. The order is heard by all 5 tanks simultaneously. Each crew knows its specific role in linebacker right. 2 tanks lay suppressing fire. 2 tanks maneuver to a specific flanking position. 1 provides overwatch. The action begins in a coordinated fashion within seconds of the order. The total time for a coordinated American response from observation to the initiation of action was consistently under 30 seconds, and often as low as 15 seconds. Quantifying the impact, the 60-second advantage. This created a conservative decision cycle advantage of at least 60 seconds for the Americans. The implications of this single minute were profound. First shot advantage. The American platoon could deploy, maneuver, and fire its first volley before the German unit had even finished reporting the contact up its chain of command. Initiative seizure. By acting first, the American platoon forced the Germans onto the reactive. The German commander was now spending his 2-minute ODA loop responding to the American maneuver, rather than executing his own plan. Attrition ratio. This time advantage directly impacted loss ratios. A platoon that can shoot, move, and communicate faster will inflict disproportionate losses while suffering fewer of its own. It is the difference between destroying the enemy while they are still deploying and fighting them after they are aimed and ready. Morale and tempo. The constant, rapid pressure created by a faster ODA loop has a shattering effect on enemy morale. German crews began to feel that the Americans were omnipresent and prescient, able to anticipate their every move. This eroded the confidence that was so critical to the German concept of Auftragstaktik. This speed of command was the unquantified variable that explains historical puzzles. It explains how platoons of inferior Shermans could consistently outmaneuver and defeat Panthers and Tigers. They were not winning because their shells magically penetrated thicker armor. They were winning because they fired more often, from more unexpected directions, and forced the superior German tanks to fight a battle for which they were not optimized. The American advantage was not measured in millimeters of steel, but in seconds of time. They had mastered the clock, and in doing so, they mastered the battlefield. The staggering tactical advantage demonstrated by the American SCR-500 series radio sets poses a critical historical question. Why did the technologically sophisticated Third Reich, a nation that produced the V-2 rocket and the jet engine, fail to develop and field a comparable network communication system for its armored forces? The answer is not one of technical inability, but a tragic confluence of doctrinal inertia, industrial fragmentation, and strategic myopia. The German military saw the radio as a tool for command, not as the backbone of a collective combat consciousness. This fundamental misunderstanding, this ignored legacy, left the Wehrmacht fighting a networked war with a hierarchical toolkit. German radio technology was, in many respects, advanced. The FUG-5 transceiver, standard in command tanks, was a capable piece of equipment for its time. Later developments, like the FUG-7 and FUG-8, offered improved range and functionality for higher echelon command. The Germans were also pioneers in frequency-hopping spread-spectrum technology with their Courier system, a revolutionary concept for secure communications. However, these were specialized, niche technologies that never saw widespread deployment. The core problem was not the peak of their technological achievement, but the base of their distribution and doctrinal application. The German philosophy remained entrenched in a pre-war mindset where radio was a luxury for commanders, not a necessity for every crew. This doctrinal failure was rooted in the very structure of the German command system. The Wehrmacht was built on a strict, top-down hierarchy. Information flowed up and orders flowed down. Equipping every tank with a transmitter was seen as not just logistically burdensome, but potentially disruptive. It would empower junior leaders and individual crews in a way that challenged the rigid control central to the German military ethos. Why would a common Panzer driver need to transmit? His role was to drive, not to contribute to the tactical picture. This mindset prevented the German army from grasping the emergent property of a fully networked force. That the collective intelligence of all its parts was far greater than the understanding of any single commander. Compounding this doctrinal inertia was the chaotic nature of the German industrial war effort. Unlike the United States, where production was centralized and standardized under entities like the War Production Board, German armaments were produced by competing firms, Telefunken, Lorenz, Siemens, with different design philosophies and political connections. This led to a proliferation of radio models that were often not interoperable. A tank from one factory might have a FUG-5, while a tank from another, produced just months later, might have a different variant with incompatible components. Spare parts were a nightmare. This lack of standardization made the concept of a universal issue of full transceivers a logistical impossibility, even if the doctrine had demanded it. The American SCR-508 was a standard kit bolted into every Sherman on the assembly line. The German equivalent was a custom installation, varying from unit to unit and factory to factory. Furthermore, the German war economy, perpetually starved of critical raw materials like copper and rubber, prioritized its resources for what it deemed decisive weapons: the Tiger's armor, the Panther's gun, the V-2's guidance system. Radios for every tank were a low priority. They were considered ancillary equipment, not a primary weapon system. A commander might argue that he needed more Tigers, but he would rarely argue that he needed more powerful radios for the Panzer IVs he already had. This reflected a materialistic view of combat power, where victory was determined by the quality of individual platforms, not the quality of the network connecting them. The consequences of this ignored legacy were evident in the post-war assessments of both Allied and German commanders. American technical intelligence teams were often unimpressed with the captured German radio sets, noting their complexity, lack of standardization, and limited distribution. Meanwhile, German veterans consistently remarked on the bewildering speed and coordination of American armored units, a capability they attributed to superior numbers or air power, rarely pinpointing the true source: the chattering radio in every single tank. In the end, the failure to match the American radio network was a catastrophic strategic oversight. It was a failure to understand that the nature of warfare had evolved. The Third Reich invested in creating sharper, harder individual spearheads, believing that tactical excellence could overcome operational and strategic deficits. The United States invested in creating a smarter, faster nervous system, understanding that in the fog of war, shared awareness was the ultimate weapon. The Germans built better individual fighters. The Americans built a better team. The legacy of their superior radio technology remained locked in laboratories and limited-run production, ignored in favor of a doctrine that valued the command of a few over the communication of the many. It was a lesson paid for in blood on the battlefields of Europe, a lesson written in the clear, efficient chatter of the SCR-508 that the German High Command, for all its brilliance, never learned to hear. The history of armored warfare in World War II has long been narrated as a contest of steel and shot. The traditional metrics of victory and defeat are measured in millimeters of armor, the caliber of guns, and the technical specifications laid out in factory manuals. This narrative celebrates the brute force of the Tiger's 88mm gun and laments the Sherman's perceived inadequacies. But this focus on the tangible has obscured the war's most decisive armored weapon, a weapon that was not seen, but heard. The true victor of the armored battles of 1944 to 1945 was not a tank at all, but the network communication system it carried. The radio did not win the war alone, but it was the critical enabler that allowed the massive production of good enough tanks to defeat the limited production of exquisite ones. It was the unseen weapon that turned a collection of individual vehicles into an intelligent, adaptive, and ultimately unstoppable force. The fundamental error in the tank versus tank analysis is that it evaluates armored forces as gladiators in an arena. In reality, they were complex military systems operating in a chaotic environment. The core challenge of armored command is not merely to destroy the enemy in front of you, but to understand where the enemy is, what he is doing, and how to bring your own strength to bear upon his weakness before he can do the same to you. This is a battle of information. The side that can gather, process, and act on information faster will win, regardless of the individual capabilities of its platforms. The American SCR-508 radio was the tool that gave the U.S. Army a decisive, overwhelming advantage in this informational battle. This advantage manifested in three transformative ways: shared awareness, distributed command, and systemic resilience. Shared awareness, as detailed in prior chapters, meant that the sight of one tank became the knowledge of five. A German Panzer unit advanced like a man feeling his way through a dark room, his hands outstretched. An American platoon moved through the same space with the lights on, each member able to see and call out obstacles and opportunities. This collective consciousness neutralized the German advantages in gunnery and armor. A Tiger might have been able to kill a Sherman at 2,000 meters, but it rarely got the chance to do so against a network platoon that could pinpoint its location from a brief muzzle flash and then maneuver to flank it under a coordinated smokescreen. Distributed command was the natural corollary to shared awareness. The American system did not just make information flow faster, it changed who could use it. By empowering every tank commander to transmit, the U.S. Army effectively decentralized decision-making. The platoon leader was no longer the sole brain of the unit. He was the coordinator of 5 intelligent nodes. This distributed system was far more robust and adaptive than the German model. The loss of a platoon leader was a temporary setback, not a catastrophic decapitation. The network would instantly reconfigure, with the next senior commander taking over with a complete tactical picture already in hand. This resilience meant that American units could sustain losses and continue the mission, while German units, reliant on a few key leaders, often fractured under similar stress. Finally, the radio was the linchpin that integrated the tank into the broader combined arms system. A Sherman was not just a tank. It was a mobile observation post for the artillery, a spotter for close air support, and a communications hub for coordinating with infantry. A German tank was largely a standalone weapon. An American tank was a single instrument in a vast orchestra, and the radio was the conductor, allowing it to play its part in harmony with all the others. The devastating effectiveness of American artillery, the dreaded time-on-target strikes that could obliterate a German position in minutes, was only possible because a tank commander at the point of contact could call it down with speed and precision. When we re-evaluate famous engagements through this lens, the outcome becomes less mysterious. The Shermans' victories were not flukes or the result of sheer numbers alone. They were the logical outcome of a superior combat system. The radio was the force multiplier that turned the Shermans' numerical advantage into a tactical one. It allowed American units to dictate the terms of engagement, to ambush the ambushers, and to overwhelm the enemy not with a mindless tide of steel, but with a coordinated, intelligent swarm. The legacy of this unseen weapon extends far beyond the Second World War. The American emphasis on command, control, communications, and intelligence, C3I, became a cornerstone of its military doctrine during the Cold War and into the 21st century. The lessons learned from the network platoons in Normandy directly informed the development of modern battle networks, where every soldier, vehicle, and aircraft is a sensor and a shooter in a fully integrated digital web. In the final analysis, to claim that radios won the armored war is not an overstatement. It is a necessary correction to a historical record overly focused on hardware. The Sherman, with its world's most advanced radio, was not an inferior tank. It was the most effective tank of its day because it was the most connected. It won not because it was the strongest or the hardest, but because it was the smartest. The true battle was not fought solely in the fields of France, but in the ether, on the frequencies of the SCR-508, where the constant, calm chatter of American tank crews orchestrated the defeat of the Wehrmacht's finest panzers. The unseen weapon, the radio, was the one that truly mattered.